Apologies. My name is Nicole Cooke. I am the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair and Professor at the University of South Carolina at the School of Information Science. And I'm so grateful to be able to host this special Augusta Baker lecture, and also very excited to have our guests with us this morning. So just very quickly, for housekeeping, I have pinned the speakers so you can locate them in the Zoom room. And I ask that everyone would mute themselves, and you'll have plenty of time and opportunity to ask questions at the end. And this session will be recorded and will be posted on the Augusta Baker website in about a week. And once we get started, I'll be sure to put that link into the chat. All right, so let's get started. I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Ray Pun, who has brought us all together today and will be my co-moderator for this very special panel. So Ray, pronouns he, him, his, is the academic and research librarian at the Alder Graduate School of Education. In this role, he supports all library services from research to scholarly communication. With over 17 years of experience, Ray has worked as a librarian in institutions such as Stanford University, Fresno State, New York University Shanghai, and the New York Public Library. He has published and presented extensively and is an active member of the American Library Association. Most recently, Ray served as the 50th president of the Chinese American Librarians Association, CALA, and the 42nd president of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, APALA. Ray holds a doctorate in educational leadership from California State University, Fresno, a master's of library science from CUNY Queens College, and a Master's of Arts in East Asian Studies and a Bachelor of Arts in History from St. John's University. So I think we all know Ray, and very, very grateful to be co-hosting with him today. So Ray, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicole Cooke. Really appreciate everyone making time today for being here. And thank you so much for coming together and giving us an opportunity, Dr. Cooke, to talk about grants and the opportunities for funding. And so this was a special webinar focusing on this topic that many of us are really thinking about, in terms of grants being a opportunity to increase engagement and increase support for our communities. And also it's one to build off the work in sustainable ways, right? It's not just one grant, soft money, and then things are resolved, but rather an ongoing process to engage with different stakeholders internally and externally, because the work we do is more than the library itself, right? It's rather like securing funding, securing opportunities for our communities. And so I thought there's more folks coming in. Please feel free to share in the chat box where you're coming from. It would be great to see where folks are coming from. And then I will now introduce our panelists for today's session. So first we have Elizabeth Joseph, who is the Assistant Director of New Rochelle Public Library in New York. Elizabeth is currently the Assistant Director following an illustrious 18-year tenure at the Ferguson Library in Stamford, Connecticut. During her time at Ferguson Library, she notably served as the Associate Director of Community Engagement. Her impactful contributions to the library field led her recognition as a library mover and shaker in 2015, primarily for her dedicated work with local entrepreneurs. She was the lead organizer for Stamford 1 Million Cups and Stamford's Startup Weekend. She is a chapter contributor for the book Libraries That Build Business, Advancing Small Business and Entrepreneurship in Public Libraries, published by ALA Public Policy and Advocacy Office in 2022. Elizabeth remains engaged and committed member of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association. Moreover, she actively takes on the role of a mentor for emerging professionals, guiding them on their career path and leadership journeys. Next, we have Sarah Lemire, who's a professor and librarian at Texas A&M University and a professor of English at this institution. Sarah, her work centers on teaching students how to find, evaluate, and use information effectively. Her research is focused on three primary areas: library services for student veterans, information literacy, and first-generation students, and open educational resources. And then now we have Carolyn Vibert, school librarian, Sutley Elementary School in Prince William County Schools. Carolyn is currently a K-5 elementary school librarian in Northern Virginia, where she serves over 600 students in a Title I school with a predominant Hispanic population and English learners. Carolyn has previous experience in 2 additional school libraries and was a 4th grade teacher. She holds a current national board certification in library media, and Carolyn has many interests within the field of school librarianship, including mentoring new librarians, tabletop gaming instruction, and any project that will make her library welcoming and vibrant for students. She has contributed several articles to the School Library Connection, including Begin Your Grant Writing Adventure Today, which is included in ABC Clio's School Library Management 8th edition by Carl Harvey and Audrey Church, published by ABC Clio in 2022. Carolyn is an active member of the American Association of School Librarians as a chairperson for the School Library Event Promotion Committee. She served on the 2023 National Conference Committee as a programming co-chair and has served on several previous committees. Carolyn is a past president of her state affiliate of VAASL. So welcome, Carolyn, Elizabeth, and Sarah. Thank you all so much for making time to share with us your expertise, your advice, your wisdom, and thoughts. And so we would start off with a question here. And folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box, and then we'll get right to them at the end. So our first question is, what is your experience with the grant writing process or securing funds for your libraries? Maybe if you want to talk about the grants you've gotten in the past and amounts, what is the grant's purpose? Did you have collaborators? And does the grant fit with your professional goals, or is it part of your job? So we'll start off with Elizabeth.
I guess I'll start by unmuting myself. Thank you, Ray. This is a great opportunity to talk about just grants for libraries and the work that we do. So yes, I have gotten extensive experience with grant writing over the past, I would say, over past decade or so, maybe even 20 years. I think that the first time I was asked to submit a grant, I was really anxious, right? I thought, like, you have to be a real professional, like you have to have all of this experience to write grants, submit grants. But the first grant that I wrote, I was very successful and I got the grant, and it was a pretty significant amount. And I believe that when you have success like that, it builds confidence in your grant writing abilities and your grant seeking abilities. So since then, since that sort of, I think, $12,000 award, I have received tens of thousands of grants. And as I started to gain some success from that experience, I learned that it sort of became part of my job, but it was also something that I really appreciated doing. And you can't deny the marketability of like grant writing experience, right? And that record. So yes, and because I was library mover and shaker for the work I've done with small business owners and entrepreneurs, a lot of my grants sort of centered around that work. In addition to other things as well, but mainly it's been around entrepreneurship.
Great, thank you. How about Carolyn and then Sarah?
Well, as a school librarian, my grant experience is definitely on the lower dollar end of the spectrum than Elizabeth's. I haven't received any grants over $5,000. And most of the grants I received are community funded. Many communities have local educational foundations, which are just an enormous resource for our educators and our school librarians. My guess is there's not a lot of school librarians here today, but maybe a few will be watching the recording. And those local foundations are a great place to tap into. I have, as Ray said earlier, I have varied interests. So I have gotten grants on embryology equipment for our students to do chick hatching. I've had grants secured for listening centers in our school classrooms. I've gotten sets of books put into book talk kits for students. I used a grant to start my tabletop gaming collection in my library. So it was the first seed money I got to make that initial purchase of games, and that has grown from there. And then as educators, we have an awesome resource in the Donors Choose platform. And many of you have probably heard of that and maybe even contributed to that in some way over the past decade. Donors Choose has really grown to be a powerful way for school librarians and educators to secure funding for specialty projects in their schools.
This is so interesting to hear everyone else's experiences and how similar they are. I am an academic librarian, and grant writing was not formally part of my job responsibilities. It was not something I had to do, but it was an opportunity for me to try things and kind of get administrative support to try things that maybe I would not have been able to do otherwise. I've received grants that kind of internal, like institutional grants, as well as like federal grants ranging between, I would say, about $3,000 and $150,000. And have kind of taught myself as I go and relied on the very generous expertise of others to kind of figure out, how does this work? What does it look like when my institution wants me to write a grant? What does it look like when IMLS wants me to write a grant? And how do I put this together? I've used grants primarily in two areas. Internally, looked at like teaching grants. I'm an instruction librarian in my librarian job. And so like teaching grants internally in the institution have been opportunities to collaborate with teaching faculty to try different things, to try applying a new pedagogical technique, develop a new curriculum. At the federal level, my grant writing has been primarily focused on my work with student veterans, writing grants to develop as library orientation for student veterans and to host a national forum on libraries and veterans. So kind of those are the two kind of main veins that I've worked in, but I've found that both have been, like, funding agencies seem to have been very receptive to both of those areas.
That's excellent. Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. I just wanted to raise up a point that we're hearing about a really wide range of grant opportunities. And just, want to emphasize to the audience, we love a good small grant, right? We can't all get the 150 million, but we can do so much with a $5,000 seed grant or something of that nature. So I wanted to raise that up. And just a quick follow-up for Carolyn and Elizabeth. Sarah mentioned kind of learning on the job about how to write grants. Did you both kind of learn on your own, or did you have any type of training or instruction on grant writing?
That's a great question. My MLS program had, I think, one module in a course related to grant writing. And so I don't know that I used that experience until maybe 5 years after that course, but I do remember going back to my notes from that professor to look for that information so that I would have some way to wrap my mind around that first application, because it does not matter how much money is on the table. It could be $500 for a micro collection, but it still can be confusing, and you wonder, what are they really asking for? So that was helpful to me, but a lot of it's just learning on the job.
Yeah, I would agree. I also learned a lot, just sort of self-directed learning. And what I did is I looked at successful grant applications, if people were willing to share them, and really learned by reading those and understanding the process behind it and asking just successful grant writers like what their strategies were. So yes, a lot of this is very self-directed.
Excellent, thank you. And just to the audience, self-directed is very effective.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but also note to the library educators that we need to cover this more. But leading into the second question, what have you learned about grant writing and securing funds? So for example, we know that it's self-directed, less formal education, but what are some of the things that you wish you had known going into these processes?
So I guess I'll start first. I think what's really important is to gather data, right? I think gather data and understand the data. So whether it's about not just participants and engagement, but the outcomes that we're looking to achieve, I think all of that is really an intrinsic part of like the grant application process. I've also learned that marketing plans are really important to the funders. They really want to know that the money that they're investing in your project or your program is going to go a long way, and it's going to really reach a wide swath of people. A lot of times people have a framework for like the program or like the service, right? But they don't have all the specifics. And I think that even if you have the money or don't have the money, or you're looking to get the money, you need to have all of those questions answered. And you really need to have a solid plan in place, because a lot of times we think, well, we don't have the money. Why should we spend so much time in like thinking about it and designing it? And we never really know what the funders are looking for. So it's really important to understand what their own funding strategies are and what are the things that they have funded in the past, and what things like speak to them both on sort of the collective level as a board and as individuals. So really understanding what the goals are for the funder.
So how about Sarah next, then Carolyn?
Sure. So I agree with everything Elizabeth said. When I was thinking about this question, one of the things that kind of jumped out to me was how valuable the process of grant writing is in terms of kind of crystallizing what you're thinking about, and also as a networking opportunity. So it's been through the process of applying for internal grants that I've reached out to people that I would never have encountered otherwise in my institution and learned about their work. And we've identified potential areas to collaborate, not just on this project, but potentially on others. I've met folks from other institutions as looking for, like, I am looking for an advisory board about this grant. And I cold call people, which I would never do in any other circumstance. But it's really been an opportunity to grow my network in a way that has had many ramifications outside of the specific grant itself. So that's, I think, just one of those lessons learned that is maybe not about successful grant applications, but why it's helpful to apply, even if, it doesn't end up funding.
I've learned several lessons. The first one is more related to me personally, and that is that I have to plan ahead. I have missed so many grant deadlines. Sometimes I think, oh, I have to submit this, and it's right at the last minute, and I have it ready to go. And then one time I didn't click the button. But in the education world, a lot of our grants are cyclical. So they come around every year and they're regular funding. So what I've learned from that about myself and about grants is that you can plan ahead and see maybe what just closed, and then you have 12 months to write that application and to work on the project and think about the right fit between what the goals and priorities of the funder is compared to what you need. And then kind of like what Elizabeth was saying about data and assessment, as I write the grant, I am always writing my assessment tools as I'm writing the grant application, because as I think I've established, I'm a little bit of a work to the deadline person, not necessarily a procrastinator, but I just work all the way up with every inch of bit of time I can use. And so I have found that for me, with education grants, it's all about student learning. We need academic outcomes. Anybody funding and any education project, it is always centered on students. So I have to include how am I going to assess students? How am I going to gather data from teachers? So if I want to say that I'll survey teachers about a result, then I'm going to write that survey or make as much as I can of those tools as I'm writing the grant application. And that's really helped me. And then I just keep a list of projects I have in mind that someday I might get to if I have the funding. And my apologies if it's a little loud. It's I got a class walking to lunch next to me. I keep a list and I make notes in a document so that if the right bit of funding comes available, I can say, oh, maybe now the time is right to try this wacky project that I didn't need to do a few years ago, but now I'm ready for. So I just have to kind of keep those notes going and keep looking for the plan ahead so that I don't miss deadlines and I have the right fit for the funding that's available.
Wow, that was really great insight there and the lessons learned from all of you, and thinking about this opportunity that you have in different moments in your career. And of course, the most important thing is that once you get the grant, you actually have to implement it, right? You actually have to do the whole work. And I think there's something to be said about unexpected changes that might happen. And I think that's something people who have written grants, like all of us here, have done. And then something tends to happen where it doesn't necessarily play out all the time, but it gives us a chance to it reflect and how to incorporate it better. So I'll say briefly, I received an IMLS grant working with so many collaborators, and we were going to do a national forum, like what you were saying, Sarah, for a specific group. But then because of COVID, becoming more and more affecting the work we're doing, we had to make it online instead of in person. And so that really throws everything into a different kind of experience instead of in person, which is what we had intended with the grant office for IMLS. So things can kind of really change. And so we wanted to ask you, you mentioned different types of grants. Carolyn, you mentioned the educators grants that you've seen locally, and Sarah with the IMLS, and Elizabeth with other types of grants out there. So how do you find grants or funding opportunities? So in addition to IMLS or NSF or Mellon, like these huge ones, but literally, where do you go? Do you subscribe to listservs, newsletters? Do you look up these foundation websites? Where else do you look or consider for grants and funding? So maybe we'll start with Sarah.
Sure. And Ray, I really enjoyed that story because our forum grant was scheduled to be held in person in June 2020, and it did not. We had to completely reconceive it. So yes, it's one step in front of the other, always. And so thinking about where I've looked for grants, I think I've done it in a couple of ways. So sometimes I have an idea and like, this is a project that I want to try, like I've brainstormed this idea and I want to find funding. And then I will go out and look for funding, IMLS, state funding. Sometimes I've gone to like our actual development officer on campus and look for donor funding. But then other times I will, because I'm at an academic institution, I'll get emails that say, here's a list of from our research office, here's all the funding opportunities that our grants office has identified. And I'll go, oh, you know what, this actually is kind of interesting. And they're looking for somebody who is incorporating this, new pedagogy thing. And could I maybe contact somebody in a different department if we could collaborate on something, and a new idea will come from that. So I would say sometimes it's taking the idea and looking for that funding source, but sometimes it's also taking inspiration from that call for applications. And those often come from things like email. Sometimes I'll see them come through social media. Sometimes someone will just email me a funding opportunity, and sometimes I'll just be there are just some organizations that I follow, our, at our state organizations, our higher education coordinating board, our Center for Teaching Excellence, places like that, that I just kind of send me if there's any news on this. And every once in a while, just something pings, and that it can be a really fruitful way to find opportunities.
How about Elizabeth and then Carolyn?
So I think as public libraries, we know that there are certain places to look, right? So it starts with all of our national library organizations like ALA and PLA, and then there's the state library associations and the state libraries. And we know that there's always grants and funding opportunities there. But for the longest time, I was the coordinator of the foundation network at our library. And so I had access to all of, Candid and all of those databases from the foundation center. So that was really a place that I went to if I needed to find funding for a specific program that didn't fit sort of the library funding landscape. But in addition to that, like also funding through the National Endowment of Humanities and the arts. And then I think just as important as all of those national and big federal organizations are local community foundations, which I think that all of us have talked about. And they have been extremely supportive. And it's great because there's already an existing relationship with them and they're aware of our organizations and what we do and what we're capable of. I found them to be extremely helpful. I think the Big Read grant is something that we have like gotten several years, and that's been a really exciting and fun grant to write as well.
I liked, Sarah, when you said you can find them on social media. That is so true. Sometimes I'll keep an eye out, and if a colleague has said that they got funding somewhere, I'll like, oh, wait, I haven't heard about that grant. And then I'll go online and find out what the timeline is for that one, because again, it's often one of those cyclical grants that comes around every year. And so then I add it to my calendar, my notes, and look at my list of projects to see what might be a good fit. I am teaching in a very large school district, and so we do have a grants coordinator, and she keeps a database updated for us, which is wonderful. But I've also just been known to sometimes search for lists of lists, because there are some resources out there that'll, list lots of grants. Thank you, Rachel, for putting the one into the chat box. That's an awesome resource. I'm going to check that out. And sometimes you just got to click a lot of dead links to see what is still being funded into the future, and what they might have run out of money or the project might have stopped, especially for low dollar amounts. But sometimes it's just kind of a dead end trail, or you might get lucky.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up. When you said social media, we're talking about X, Twitter, Threads, Spill. There's so many. Instagram. Which ones?
I have not updated my Twitter app yet. So my Twitter app still says Twitter. And that tends to be where I see some, but I'm trying to get behind Blue Sky and Instagram a little bit more.
And how about you, Sarah?
Yes, I would say the same, that Twitter has been useful for that for me in the past. But like sometimes I still see stuff coming across on Facebook from like certain agencies and stuff like that. And so that can also be a good place to just, I don't know, every once in a while scroll through sometimes to something, piques your interest, and, like, oh, I'm going to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I just wanted to remark what all of you shared, and especially Elizabeth, honing in on the different levels of grants from ALA, as well as the state chapters and state libraries. So of course, it happened yesterday with the Fund Libraries advocacy work, that many library workers around the country flew to DC to talk to legislators and so forth to ask for federal funding. And I'm just going to drop the link here because it's still an opportunity for all of us, whether or not you're a member of ALA or any other group, to reach out to Congress to ask them to fund libraries so that those grants will go to IMLS, which then other people would get them from the library world, as well as the state library associations and the state libraries, and then they'll get them, and then it sort of trickles down from there, right? So grants don't just happen in the state libraries or state library associations. They get them because of these federal funding that happens. So feel free to take a look at that website. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Nicole Cooke.
Yeah, to Ray, just to add to that, I think that when we learned that ACP, which is the Affordable Connectivity Act, was ending, one of the first things that we did in our library community was to reach out to our elected officials and told them that how important this fund was for so many members of our community who are still sort of struggling to have access to Wi-Fi and internet connection. So yes, I think that it's not just about money, but it's also, it's also about them knowing what our issues are and what areas need to be funded. So I think that's really important.
So important, thank you. I just wanted to toss out another opportunity for finding out about grants. We all go to conferences, and when we get these grants, we have to say, we like to say, but sometimes it is a requirement to say, in this project has been generously sponsored by whomever, right? And certainly that is, I found out about a couple of the smaller ALA grants and some of the smaller association grants from the actual grantees, right? So, just keep your ear open when you're at your conferences. Another thing I wanted to mention is that depending on what you're working on, you all should be free to think about applying for multiple grants at one time. So, that was a little bit new to me. I'm on a university campus, and when I went for an internal grant, one of their questions was, who else are you asking for money? Who else, who else is supporting this project, right? So especially when there's smaller grants, if the guidelines permit, you all should go for as many grants as you can, to fund your project. So to the next question, this is kind of the part that we all hate, but it does happen. How do you handle not getting the grants, right? I think it's like a lot of our other projects, these become our babies. And then when they're not funded, we could feel away. So I wanted to ask how you cope with that, not only psychologically, right, the disappointment of it, but what happens to those projects? Do they go on? Do you table them? Just want to hear some of your experiences on that end of the spectrum. Let's start with Elizabeth, and then we'll go to Sarah and Carolyn.
Oh gosh, like that is like a really heartbreaking, disappointing moment. I think that it takes a while to kind of recover from that sort of failure or disappointment. So I think that once you've gotten over that, once you've sort of recovered from knowing that you didn't get the grant, I think then you sort of hit the road running, right? It's sort of like, okay, if this project is really important to you and to your organization, how else can you fund it? And I think that a lot of grant applications will also ask you to talk about sustainability, because no funder wants to just fund it for like that funding year or that funding period. So because we have thought about the sustainability of that project beyond the grant year, we then start to rely on what we had decided, right? So whether it's changing our operational budgets or seeking funding from another source, or going, in our case, to our library foundation, to our friends organization, we really have to then really pivot in terms of like how we're going to fund it. And if sometimes it doesn't happen that year, but then we have to plan for it in the next year, or or scale it down, in fact, or sort of rearrange our programs, or just not make it as grand as like we thought that we would, and maybe just like follow on like a smaller component of our project.
So just to build on that, I think I look at grant writing as almost like a numbers game. The more you do, the more you're going to get, but also the more you're going to get rejected. I am absolutely sure I have been rejected and not funded more times than I have been funded. And, it is what it is. I think that work is never really lost. Sometimes you revise and you submit it again. Right? Try again the next cycle with some changes. Sometimes you repackage it for a different funding opportunity. Sometimes, we've been like, this was a small project, we wanted to do this collaboration to revise the pedagogy. We didn't get funded, but there might be a way we can do it just without funding. And that's happened. And sometimes it just kind of goes, into your back pocket, and it might inform a later project, or it might, hang out there for a while and then be like, oh, actually I have this, this kind of project that maybe has shifted and morphed since I tried, a few years ago, but now I can use this in a different way. So I think it's always worthwhile. I mean, it's disappointing when it's not funding. It certainly is, but that time is never wasted. I think even if you're just thinking through the process, like, having to really crystallize this and sell it to somebody else really helps you figure out what the parameters of this project are, what your idea is, how, like, what it's going to look like. And like that process is worthwhile anyway.
absolutely, you can always pull something for the future from a project that didn't go through the first time. Colleagues and I from different schools tried to get a grant funded. We were essentially writing the grant for passive programming supplies a decade ago, before passive programming became a thing. And so I think the local foundation was probably very confused by why we were asking for puppet supplies, magnets, board games, this variety of tools and resources, because they couldn't see the focus in it that we could see. And so we had to like take it apart and scale back and say, okay, maybe this is not, the right thing right now. How could we do this on our own with the supplies we have? Because we were essentially trying to write our grant for kits of supplies that would rotate between libraries, because our students don't need the same resource all year long, but it's great when it's infused and they get it for a few months and it's a novelty, and then we could pass it on to another school. And I think the committee probably just didn't understand but what we were trying to accomplish, but we grew from that experience. And so we can always take pieces of that away. I think that it's really important to keep parts of those grant applications already written, especially the bits about your community demographics and your organization's mission and your vision, what your hopes and dreams are for your program, because you can always use those pieces later in something else.
Well, that was really great to share that. And certainly all of us who are excited have applied for grants in different ways, or just applying for things, right? As they say, it's always a no, right? If you don't try, that's often the advice that I've received. And it means that the feedback that you get, which sometimes are really helpful, can help you think about the next steps going forward of repurposing for some collaboration. And maybe it's the timing, right? Sometimes there are new opportunities that come in where it's more aligned. And so I want to just share what everyone has said already, like, don't give up, right? Keep working on it and exploring those collaborative opportunities. And we want to really give a lot of time for folks to ask questions or thoughts. Feel free to share in the chat box. And we're going to move on to our final question, which is thinking about tips and advice for new folks who are, or those who are interested in applying. Like, what should they be really thinking about from your personal experiences or thoughts? So we'll start with Carolyn, and then Sarah, and Elizabeth.
So my local educational foundation is really focused on innovation, and that's what a lot of grants are focused on, right? They want new ideas, they want it to be innovative. And what I've realized is that innovation does not mean that I need to have an idea that no one else has had or described before, but ideas need to be innovative to my students and to my community. And so once I was able to reframe that, then I felt like I had more confidence to apply for some grants that with an idea that felt a little more basic to me, even though it really is something that my students needed. And then the other thing, maybe specifically for school librarians, but sometimes it can be very difficult to get funding for library books. There are some great larger national grants to get funding for library collections, but on the local level, it's often quite challenging. I told my principal once, I said, look, I can get funding for the supplies for my lessons. I can get chicken equipment. I can get board games. I can get all these other supplies through grant funding, but I can't get library bound books. So I have to be sneaky. So every grant that I write, I try to embed a mini collection along with it. And I do have chickens on the brain because it's hatch season right now. So my incubators are set up in the library currently. But when I wrote that grant to get equipment for all of our kindergarten classes and for the library, I included a chicken collection along with it. So my library has 25 books about chickens, which every time we hatch, I'm so thankful we have that resource. So if you need library books about a particular project, if you have the project that goes along with it, like a gardening grant, then you can get gardening books or cooking books that go along with that topic. And that's a way I try to be a little bit sneaky to also grow my collection at the same time that I'm adding another resource to the library.
So the piece I wanted to add in this piece, or in this, for this question was, like, I apply for grants because there are things that I want to do, and I think that, right, grant funds are going to allow me to do that. But sometimes those grants don't get funded, and that funding is not a failure. It's not perceived as a failure by my institution. It shows that you're trying. And grant writing, right, just trying it out, it helps you develop a very useful and also marketable skill. And putting in grants, even if you're not getting traction right yet, it's showing your institution that you are interested in doing this. You're learning, you're growing, and you're interested in pushing your library, your organization in new directions. And that's all perceived positively. So if you're feeling like, I'm afraid I'm going to fail, don't feel like writing a grant and not getting funding is failure. It is part of the growth process, and it is perceived positively. Like, on my annual evaluation, if I submitted a grant and it didn't get funding, that is still considered evidence of my work and that I'm doing stuff. So it's absolutely a positive thing, even if it doesn't get funded. You're going to get funded if you keep trying.
I want to add that I believe that this whole process of grant writing and getting grants is not a solitary activity, right? It's not just sort of one person behind a computer and like typing away. It includes sort of the cooperation and the participation engagement of the whole team, because you alone as a grant writer is not the one that's like detailing the finances and building the programs and doing the outcomes and all of that. So I really believe that sort of before writing and submitting the grant, and even sort of after, that you really bring a group of people that are going to be involved and get their feedback and their ideas and sort of bring it together. I think that that's really important. I also think that it's important to like make sure that you actually read the grant application very thoroughly. Look at the questions, like really dig deep and dive into those questions. And once you're done, read and review and make sure that like you are actually answering the questions. I also think that sometimes, even if grant funders don't ask this question, it's really important to talk about the impact that the grant and the project will have on your community. So it's really about the funds which really make a difference in terms of like equalizing opportunities and being inclusive and really bringing the program to people that sometimes might not have access to it. And really it's more than just about like achieving some goals and outcomes based on like how successful it is, but it's really like who else gets impacted. And I think that that story is an important one to tell like upfront.
Right. And I've seen people get really creative with the reports. I mean, certainly there's that expectation of filling out the forms and being really specific about the outcomes, the output, and the data that has been assessed. But like I've seen some do really good, interesting ways to push it back out on social media, or creating infographics, creating things that really highlight the different types of impact that you had with that collaborator or with the community. And that actually, for one example, another colleague told me was able to draw an attention from another grant provider, right? Because it's like, oh, wow, this is really great work you've done, and I want to continue supporting it in different ways. So just getting the word out there. So it's not just a report, a one and done, and then like it becomes its one-time thing, but rather an ongoing thing that requires more than soft money. So then I've also experienced this where it becomes operationalized, right? It becomes something that's permanent and that's sustaining in itself. And so that's something you want to achieve, right, in the end, and not just soft money, right, for a position or for some sort of other kind of project, because the work we're doing constantly requires that kind of monitoring and engagement. And so I think we are now at our Q&A time. Or Dr. Nicole Cooke, did you also have any other comments?
No, just raising up some points in the chat to give yourself as much time as possible when writing the grants. To Elizabeth's point, some of the questions are tricky, things you've never thought about. And honestly, you'll think, why do they even need to know that? And you know, like I tell my students, don't wait until the day before to, to complete this application. We're all super busy, I get it, but some of those questions could throw you for a loop. And also just to Sarah's point, I also have to list grants that I was not successful on with during my annual review, right? So that counts to you putting your name out there, putting your institution's name out there, and you know, let's be real, it's a project, right? So it is work that has been completed, whether you are funded or not. All right, so we are at Q&A time. We do have one question that I'll get us started with, but please feel free to continue adding your questions to the chat box. So we have a question from an attendee who says, I am a major gifts officer. We are considering adding private foundations to my portfolio. In my work with nonprofits, I found that grant proposal writing is really helpful for networking, developing new relationships, and clarifying thinking, like Sarah said. And it helps with major donor conversations. Is it common to have fundraisers responsible for both major gifts and foundation grants for libraries and university settings? Any thoughts about that? So Sarah, I think this is directed to you, and Ray and I might be able to weigh in a little bit as well.
Absolutely. So the institutions that I'm familiar with, it's common to have someone who is doing gifts and your development officer in housed in the library, or have a unit housed in the library that deals with donors, that deals with gifts, things like that. I've only worked at R1s, but they're the grant office on campus is more of a campus-wide service, although they tend to assign somebody directly to the library. So they're not housed in the library, but I have a point person that I work with who works with maybe a particular funding agency or two. So we might have the same grant program officer who works with IMLS and Department of Education or something like that. And somebody else works with NSF. So they get really familiar with what that funder is looking for. But I would say, in my experience, that those two elements are fairly separate. I don't know. I would be curious if others had a different experience.
I think it depends on the institution, right? So at my university, we have folks from the central or the campus-wide foundation, and their officers have a 50% appointment with foundations. And so specific to this question, and then that person would have a 50% appointment to the library. So it's almost like that person does specific work for the library, but then to Sarah's point, if there's someone that wants to apply to NSF or something that might be out of the maybe normal scope of the library, then they would go back to their colleagues at the foundation to say, you know, what about NSF, what about NIH, or what about, you know, what have you. There is also a division in our central foundations that is just for private donations. So I think to Sarah's point, it is a little separate, but I think it depends on your institution in terms of how they might bring some of these resources together. And it's going to depend on size too, right? So if you have a smaller, you know, Sarah mentioned an R1 institution, it could be different at R2. It could be different at, you know, California State that has like 20 plus campuses, whereas you have maybe a standalone R1 and they just deal, you know, in and amongst themselves. So I think it's gonna, your mileage may vary depending on what kind of institution you're at.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then the position itself too, right? So some of the positions, maybe a librarian who's on tenure track and need to do some research for their service for their requirements to be on tenure track. And so the research grants that they secure will help them with the publications, that will help them with the output, and not necessarily like a grant for a program or a project, but actually it could still be, and then it turns into some sort of publication. So for the most part, there's some that I've seen where they arrange events, arrange sort of programs that can happen related to their role. So in my previous job, I was a first-year experienced librarian, engaging with first-year students, liaisoning with different groups like the Multicultural and Gender Center. And what happened was we were able to get a talk story grant, which came from the Asian Pacific American Librarian Association and the American Indian Library Association. You should check that out. It's a really great program for funding a public program for all types of libraries, public, school, academic. And it came from those two organizations. And we were able to bring in 2 Indigenous storytellers to talk about their experiences and to really have talk story as the program is about. And then that led to our gift officer at the university, the development officer, to talk with me to get a potential donor who might be interested in funding the library's diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And it worked because we had evidence of doing this collaboration, and then it kind of built on that collaboration internally, but also externally with that donor. We were able to get, I think, $5,000 to support more initiatives and programs like that. So it really depends on the role too, and how the person sort of engages with that. So that's a really great question.
Alrighty, thank you for that. So our next question is there an average amount of time that you are spending from identifying the grant to submission?
So I'm going to answer this question because I think what I found really helpful is to have a grant schedule / calendar, right? So I really use the deadlines for each grant application and mark it down in my calendar. So I think that helps me sort of keep track of the deadlines and when documents are due. I think that I found it to be very helpful. The other thing that's also helpful and sort of keeping me organized is the level of detail like a grant needs. And so some grant applications, you can do it in a week. Some of them needs like 3 months. I mean, you really need to understand what the application is asking you, and then really just break down those different components and make sure you give yourself enough time, because the more time that you have, the better off that you are.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. It depends a lot on the actual grant and what they're asking for and how in depth. For a small institutional grant, I would say probably a couple of weeks at the minimum. For something like an IMLS grant, I would say you're looking at probably more like that 12-week time span.
And I would just add to that, it was mentioned earlier about, keeping institutional profiles and other types of more static information up to date and ready to go. So that can certainly, take some time off of the application process because you already have that information prepared. Are there any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes left, so we do still have time to ask a few more questions.
Well, let me ask all of you here, are you all working on a grant application right now as we're speaking? Is there something you're seeing?
I'll just jump in. I'm not. I'm trying to complete the 2 that I have, so.
We always apply for some grant every year. So yes, we're definitely working on the grant.
I need to start working on the Laura Bush grant now. School librarians, we don't necessarily have the luxury of writing grants during our paid contract hours. It's always an extracurricular activity. So I did not get it submitted in the fall. I didn't even work on it, but I am determined that I will apply for that grant this year. So I'm thinking maybe with 8 months, I can make it happen.
And I am working on revising a grant that did not get funded last year. So, fingers and toes and all those things crossed that this year we're able to take all that feedback and be successful. But if not, we'll keep moving on because that's the way it works.
Thanks for sharing. There was a comment here that Jasmine just submitted a grant application to increase early literacy program and purchase early literacy kits for families to check out and use at home. Well, that sounds great, Jasmine, and good luck. Hopefully you'll get that funded.
So I just wanted to offer a last kind of comment or tip. I think it's been alluded to, but just to kind of make it explicit, people should explore the possibilities and opportunities to collaborate with other people and other institutions. Ray mentioned it as well. And there are some funders and some grants that want to really see that interinstitutional collaboration. It can, help with the impact and just with the reach, right? So we've heard a lot of great stories and anecdotes and tips on kind of both ends of the spectrum in terms of things that are very institutionally specific, but also things that are for the larger field or maybe even the larger community, and in Elizabeth and Carolyn's case in particular. But just, that's part of that networking thing that we've heard about in terms of, what are the opportunities, right? And just even in terms of the grant writing and application process, more hands could make lighter work, right? So just keep in mind any and all opportunities.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dr. Cooke, because there have been moments where the library was not the actual grant applicant, but became part of like a larger community application. So I think that's another important way, not just sort of secure some funding for your role in a project, but also to get the word out, increase visibility for your organization. Very important.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Are there any last comments or thoughts from our esteemed panelists? You're getting kudos in the chat box for all of this great information. Any other thoughts or tips or?
Dr. Cooke, I'm happy to have my contact information shared if someone wants to reach out and ask a question or talk about the process.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I will include it when I post the video of today's webinar.
Thank you.
All right, getting thanks in the chat box. This has all been just so informative and inspiring, right? All of these tips and tricks and motivation to apply for that next grant. So Ray, I'm gonna have you close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Cooke. I totally agree what you just shared and what everyone here has shared. Sarah, Elizabeth, and Carolyn, thank you again for making time to share with us your thoughts, your advice, the resources, and your own experiences going through the process. It is certainly challenging at times based on your roles, but also an opportunity as we try to focus on that relationship building, those collaborations, and you could do that through grants. And so thank you all again for making time to attend, your questions, your comments, and really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Dr. Nicole Cooke, for co-moderating with me and hosting this.
Thank you all so much.